Thing
Yeah.
number four, Gary, we're moving to Intel, ticker INTC. You're saying they've got a huge problem. Their last two generations of CPUs have been failing at a huge rate. Thing number four, Gary, is Intel's CPUs keep crashing.
So Rob, the way I ended up finding out about this was, my laptop.
You have an Intel?
Yeah, I have a couple of them. I've used Intel since even when I went to college. That was what I had in the computer I had in my dorm room, right? I've
Yeah.
been using Intel processors for decades. Um, and my laptop is 4.5, 5 years old, something like that at this point. And at some point I'm going to need a new one. I'm sort of looking to see what was out there and started to see there are massive problems. Intel's 13th and 14th generation CPUs, particularly their high-end i7 and i9 processors. That's what you'd get in an expensive computer. These things have been crashing, and basically there is a power draw problem. There's a voltage issue where they're just taking on too much power and burning out. Now, Intel has a patch out to help unaffected chips, but either you get it in time or you don't. And there have just been far too many CPUs that have failed. And once they fail, it can't be fixed. Those chips are fried. Intel hasn't been great about helping customers whose computers have failed. It's not their fault. By their fault, I mean the customer's fault. This is on Intel. And what I'd love to see is for them to be a little more responsible, do some sort of, better recall. It would be expensive, but you got, two generations of processors. Also, shout out to AlphaSense. I do business with those guys. Through them, I've done a bunch of expert calls. I've spoken to a number of people who, just do phenomenal work in the tech space, in the chip making space. These are people who have been lifers in the semiconductor business, and they've given different opinions on this as well. But through AlphaSense, I've had access to some really high-end people to talk to about this problem.
Yeah, you mentioned that, Gary, in your takeaway in the written five things about kind of being split in terms of industry experts looking at this, either one side, end of point capability, and then the other, you talk about these Panther Lake CPUs that are coming. Are those going to save the day for Intel?
Yeah, and we got a really interesting divergence of opinions. One of the experts I spoke with, who, he was really impressive. He knew his stuff. His view was the x86 architecture has reached its useful end. That for people who aren't, following the tech market constantly, the x86 architecture is what Intel and AMD, their chips are based on that. And his view was, yeah, you're not going to be able, the only way you're going to be able to get more improvement is by drawing more power. That's not great for laptops, and why you end up with chips burning out. Most of the people have said, no, this is a fixable problem. It's a solvable problem. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm about Intel's Panther Lake 15th generation line that's supposed to come out next year. So about a year from now, maybe, maybe 5 quarters from now. Um, I think it's interesting. I'm cheering for Intel. I'd love to see them fix this. All I can tell you is if I were buying a new computer today, I wouldn't buy anything with their 13th or 14th generation processors. I also, I wouldn't buy that Panther Lake line until it's in, computers for 6 months, 9 months, a year, and see how well they're working. If I had to buy a new computer today, I'd probably go with AMD. Or at some point, we're going to get some really great options for ARM processors. Those are the ones made by Qualcomm that you probably have their Snapdragon chips are probably in your cell phones or potentially Samsung's high-end lines use those Qualcomm ARM-based chips. And the interesting thing about those is because they've been optimized for mobile devices, they're really good at not using too much power. So
Hmm.
potentially with those, you're looking at, buying a laptop and having, either a much longer battery life, like going from 5 hours to 15 hours, or alternatively, they could make the battery smaller, give you your normal 5 to 8 hour battery life, but make the laptop lighter.
Hmm.
There are some compatibility issues with those, but I think they're sorting them out, and that's potentially interesting competition, maybe, 6 months to a year down the road.
Gary, I feel like you might be one of those industry experts the way you talk about CPUs. So I like that analysis.
You know, listen, Rob, you spend all day on the phone talking to people. Eventually, you know,
And
I've
eventually osmosis, right?
yeah, with Shockwave, I spent so much time on the phone with cardiologists and interventional cardiologists and advanced interventional cardiologists. I knew more medical jargon than I probably should have.
Very good.